that Marcus is with us. So if you can hear us, I can see you, Marcus. Please, the screen is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And can I begin by congratulating both the European Centre for the Study of Extremism and its founder, Dr. Makrum Khoury-Makhou, for having arranged such a high-level conference with an array of distinguished speakers. Turning to the subject matter for this conference, namely the 10th anniversary of the conflict in Syria, I submit that at the forefront of our attention today should be the colossal loss of human life, including women and children, that this truly awful and needless conflict has resulted in. The suffering of the Syrian people is another example of the catastrophic consequences for humanity when one country, or in Syria's case, a number of countries, imposes its will on another for geostrategic gain. Furthermore, the conflict in Syria reminds us all of the fragility of the United Nations Charter and international law in general, whereby a country's sovereignty remains vulnerable to the age-old adage that might is right. Alas, a depressing reminder of the world of realpolitik. The title of my talk today, Syria, the Kremlin's Pivot in the Arab World, is largely drawn from my new book, Arise Russia, The Return of Russia to World Politics. It is suffice to say that the legal and successful deployment of military forces to Syria by the Russian Federation has changed the dynamics of geopolitics. From its entrenched position in Syria, the Kremlin has not only thwarted attempts by Western and regional powers to collapse the Syrian government, but is also able to project Russian influence and power to the rest of the Middle East and also to North Africa, which constitutes a direct challenge to American global mastery of the region. Furthermore, Vladimir Putin's Russia has attained for itself far-reaching control over Syrian internal policymaking, which not even the Soviet Union managed to achieve in the Arab country. Now, allow me to provide a short history on Syrian-Russian relations, starting from the Soviet period, so as to set the scene on what led up to the momentous day in September 2015, when the Russian military were deployed to Syria. With the accession to power of Hafez al-Assad in Syria in 1970, the country became the Soviet Union's closest and most trusted ally in the Middle East, serving as Moscow's eyes and ears in the region, as well as in North Africa. No other Soviet ally in the world had as many Soviet military advisors stationed in their country as Syria had during the 1970s and the 1980s. At its height, the figure was approximately 5,000. The Kremlin oversaw the construction of dams and other infrastructures in Syria and provided Damascus with billion-dollar loans to purchase Soviet weaponry. Syria's military became structured on its Soviet counterpart and emerged as one of the best trained and equipped forces in the Middle East. In return for Moscow's assistance, Damascus granted the Russians use of the ports at Tartus and Latakia, which were highly important for the maintenance of the Soviet Navy's permanent presence in the Mediterranean Sea, the 5th Escadra, and the Syrians eventually signed the Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation with the USSR in 1980, which tied the Syrian state to the Soviet one, and which stipulated the strengthening of Soviet-Syrian cooperation in the Middle East, something which the Syrians had previously resisted doing over a number of years, because they had feared that doing so would have resulted in Syria eventually becoming a client state of the Soviet Union's. However, there existed serious underlying areas of tension in the Soviet-Syrian relationship. For Syria's part, the Syrians were angry that the Russians had not supplied them with more advanced combat aircraft during the 1973 war with Israel, while Damascus also resisted Soviet attempts to obtain greater use of the ports at Tartus and Latakia for itself. The USSR, for its part, was furious with Damascus for having intervened in Lebanon's civil war in support of the Maronite Christians against the Palestine Liberation Organization and socialist-oriented groups whom Moscow was aiding in the conflict. Despite its substantial economic and military investment in Syria, the Soviet Union was disgruntled that this had not resulted in greater Soviet influence over the Syrian decision-making process. With the demise of the USSR, Moscow scaled back its support to Syria and began instead formulating a new approach to Israel, Damascus's arch foe, which had begun just prior to the passing of the Soviet Union, when the Kremlin re-established diplomatic relations with the Jewish state. The Russian Federation withdrew its military personnel from Syria as the foreign policy of Boris Yeltsin favored closer ties with Israel at the expense of its historic relations with Damascus. Furthermore, the Syrians were dismayed at how the Russians had abruptly discarded decades' worth of relations with them for the sake of satisfying the Americans. The strategic relationship between Moscow and Damascus, which had endured for over 3 decades despite complications along the way, had been terminated by the Russians, leaving the Syrians resentful and suspicious of the new Russia. But with the advent of hostility and suspicion in the Kremlin over the actions of America in relation to Russian national security, and with Western pressure mounting on Syria stemming from the assassination in 2005 of former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri, which Washington held the Syrians responsible for, Moscow and Damascus, from the mid-2000s onwards, began the process of reconstructing relations with one another. Symbolically, the most telling sign which indicated that Russian-Syrian relations were about to be revived was in 2005, when Syria's President Bashar al-Assad, who had come to power following the sudden death of his father, Hafez, in 2000, said that, and I quote, "The Arab world pins great hopes on strengthening Moscow's hand in the world," end of quote. The words of the Syrian leader were followed by his first ever visit to Russia in the same year. Initially, the rejuvenation of ties between Moscow and Damascus from 2005 to 2010 was out of necessity. While increasing trade between Russia and Syria was inevitably on the agenda, the Syrians needed Moscow for political support and diplomatic cover at the UN, coupled with Damascus's need for military assistance from Russia. For their part, the Russians perceived Syria as a country which held strategic value for them, potentially providing the Kremlin with access to the Mediterranean Sea and acting as a springboard for Russia's planned re-entry into the political, economic, and military sectors of the Middle East. Accordingly, Russian-Syrian relations began to take on a new dimension, and Assad injected further impetus into the rebuilding of Russian-Syrian relations when he expressed support for Russia in its war with Georgia in 2008, holding the Americans responsible for the conflict who, the Syrian leader argued, aimed to, and I quote, "encircle and isolate Russia," end of quote. By the turn of 2011, ties between Russia and Syria had evolved into a close relationship, but one that was incomparable to the relationship which both countries had enjoyed with one another in Soviet times, and one that was limited by Russia's close economic relationship with Israel. However, an unforeseen event was to occur in Syria which would emphatically transform Russian-Syrian relations and herald the start of a new strategic partnership between Moscow and Damascus, which, remarkably, would transcend the relationship between the USSR and Syria and mark the triumphant return of Russia to the Middle East. The war in Syria, a product of an Islamist uprising supported principally by America, Britain, France, Turkey, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, to destroy the Syrian state and replace it with one compliant to the demands of the West and its regional allies, has proved to be a turning point in the Middle East. Because the Russian Federation's military intervention in the Syrian conflict has not only transformed the Russian-Syrian relationship, but has also inflicted a strategic defeat on America and has made Russia in vogue again in the Middle East. Moscow's popularity today in the Arab world is one that the Kremlin has not enjoyed since the Cold War and is a source for serious consternation in Washington. On the 30th of September 2015, the world was witness to the Russian military's entry, legal entry, I should add, into the war in Syria. Advanced fighter aircraft and bombers of the Russian Air Force arrived at the Khmeimim Air Base in Latakia and immediately began potently attacking Islamist forces strewn across Syria. As it stands today, the vast majority of Syria's territory is, as a consequence of Russian military actions, again under the jurisdiction of Damascus. Russia's return as an international state player has been epitomized by the Russian military intervention in Syria. That the Kremlin has been able to deploy and maintain its forces thousands of miles away from home and play the cardinal role in the defeat of large and powerful Islamist terrorist forces backed by America has come to symbolize the reappearance of Russia as a global superpower. The relationship between Moscow and Damascus has been transformed because of Russia's successful intervention in the Syrian conflict. The Syrian government has agreed to the Russians having a permanent military contingent in Syria, something which not even the Soviet Union had enjoyed in the country, which is comprised of the Khmeimim Air Base in Latakia and a naval base at Tartus. Previously, the latter had only been a facility for Moscow to use. The Kremlin also has a military presence at numerous Syrian Air Force bases, which it uses at its discretion. While Syria under Hafez al-Assad had tenaciously resisted attempts by the USSR to exercise a close degree of influence over Syrian decision-making, today's Syria is dependent on the Russian Federation for its very survival, politically, economically, and militarily. And some comparisons, in my estimation, can be made between the Soviet Union's relationship with East Germany and the Russian Federation's relationship with Syria. The Kremlin is now the overseer of Syria's domestic and foreign policy, the price of Russia having saved the Arab country from Islamist tyranny, thus the world of realpolitik. The Kremlin will come to use Syria as a springboard for projecting Russian power to the rest of the Middle East and North Africa too. Iraq is a country of interest for the Russians. Not only did the USSR enjoy cordial relations with Baghdad, but also Iraqis suffered appallingly from the re-emergence of ISIS in their country and look upon Russia as the country which annihilated the Islamist terrorist group in Syria, while also being aware of Washington's links to the murderous organization. With Syria and Iraq being neighbors, the Russians will attempt to use its newfound dominant position in Syria to encourage further anti-Americanism amongst Iraqis, while offering economic and, in particular, security incentives to them in return for a close relationship between Moscow and Baghdad. Furthermore, Russia is utilizing its primacy in Syria to aid the Libyan National Army, LNA, under the command of Khalifa Haftar, with Russian soldiers and Russian aircraft being deployed from Syrian territory to aid the LNA in its fight with the Islamist forces of the Government of National Accord, which is backed by both America and Turkey. In essence, Syria is a staging ground for Russia's unofficial military campaign in the war-torn Libya. And I should add that Libya is war-torn today because of the actions of NATO. With a permanent navy base and air base on Syria's coastline, Moscow will endeavor to increase its military leverage in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea by strengthening its recently resurrected permanent naval presence in the Mediterranean, the 5th Escadra, which accordingly can be expected to grow in size and in power in the coming years, and which will inevitably result in a tense encounter with the US Sixth Fleet, as occurred during the Cold War. Another highly significant consequence of Russia's new position in Syria is that it has given birth to an unofficial alliance comprising of Moscow, Damascus, and Tehran, together with Hezbollah, which will challenge Washington's hegemony in the Middle East. I believe that Iraq and Lebanon are to be the expected battlegrounds in that encounter. Ironically for the Americans, their aggression against Syria and the Syrian people resulted in Russia's return to the Middle East in a most triumphant way, and the subsequent establishment of a firm anti-American chain in the region composed of Russia, Syria, and Iran. Accordingly, Syria was pivotal to Russian resurgence in the Arab world and its reawakening on the international scene in general. The day that Putin deployed the Russian military to Syria was the day that the world bore witness to a turning point in geopolitics. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Marcus, for quite a very important perspective about the role of Russia in Syria, as well as the relations between Syria and Russia.